we will go ahead and get started. So salam alaikum, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on gold. So when we conduct these webinars, they are specifically meant for people in that particular country. And the objective here is for you to develop indigenous expertise in this particular topic. So what I would recommend is you use the chat box, which I'm going to put on the screen right there. So you can use the chat box for any questions that you may have. And at the end of the webinar, I will go through everyone's questions, and I will also allow everyone to turn on their microphones. But between now and that point, I would recommend that everyone puts their microphone on mute. I've already muted everyone, but just so we have very little interference.
Yeah, it's okay.
So unfortunately, I have never been to Egypt myself. So when you are looking at pictures in this webinar, all of them are going to be from the internet, such as this picture, which is a Landsat image of the Eastern Desert in Egypt. And the reason I put that on there is not only because you can see the bedrock, which is something we're very interested in, but you can also see color anomalies. You know, there are people who out there who actually specialize in remote sensing, and they can use some of these color anomalies and investigate those further to determine whether they are associated with some sort of mineral deposit. And then on the other side of the screen, you can see this beautiful stream network. And when we're talking about placer gold, that's pretty much what we're going for. We are going for these stream deposits. So here's the plan for the day. The plan is I am going to go through and introduce myself and my team and what we do. We're then going to talk about placer types. Then we will talk specifically about placer potential in Egypt. Then talk about mining placer deposits. And of course, then we'll have time at the very end for your questions and answers. So my team is located here in Denver, or I should say I'm located here in Denver. A lot of them are working remotely. But we've got a panel of expert structural geologists, sedimentologists, stratigraphers, and petrophysicists. And today, actually, we've got Dr. Molly Turco, who is our expert structural geologist. She is also joining us for the meeting. And what we do is we provide consultation and training services, both for the oil and gas and the mining industry. So if you would allow me, what I'm going to do really quickly is change my my microphone, just so, not my microphone, but my mouse, so it's more visible. All right, there we go. That's a lot better. So these are some of the companies that we have either done consulting work for or training work for. And you can see that it's a pretty broad spectrum from people that you've probably never heard of, like this small company, which is in Nigeria, to the bigger companies like Shell, Chevron, BP, Saudi Aramco, etc. My own background is in sedimentology and stratigraphy. And as far as mineral resources go, I have experience in uranium, vanadium, copper, potash, coal, clinker, and then placer deposits. I'm currently located in the state of Colorado, which is in the southwestern part of the US, between the cities of Denver and Boulder. And what you're looking at right here is a map that shows gold that has been produced from the state. So if you've actually watched documentaries or even cartoons, you know, there's that, I'm forgetting the name of that cartoon. He wears a hat and he's got these huge mustaches, you know, and he's always talking about gold in the hills. Historically in the US, we had the gold rush, and everyone migrated towards these Western states to look for gold. And the 4 states where most of this gold was found included Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, and California. So On this map, the colors signify the ounces, millions of ounces of gold that have been found. There's a belt called the Colorado Mineral Belt, and I live very close to it. And overall, they found 25 million ounces of gold from the Colorado Mineral Belt. So going to school here in Boulder was a great opportunity because I could go to the mountains. Through school, we'd go take field trips. We'd look at the sort of rocks that produce some of these mineral resources. And here's a picture of an abandoned mine about 45 minutes from where I live. So I have the luxury of being able to go out there and take a look at some of these rocks. When we do these webinars, I understand that we get quite the mix of attendees. I'm sure we'll have some students in here. Then we've got geologists, investors, we've got mining engineers. But as you're going through this talk, depending on what category you fit into, what I would like for you to do is focus on these questions that I put up here. So if you're a student, you should be asking yourself, I need to take courses in metamorphic and igneous rocks and structural geology and tectonics. And if your university offers these, and if university does not offer these, please talk to me about after the webinar, and I can point you in the right direction where you can get some basics of these topics. Because as a student, if you're going to be doing anything in mining, especially with respect to gold, these are things that you need to know pretty well. If you're already a practicing geologist, then you have to ask yourself, do I have a thorough understanding of lode gold deposits? If not, where would I learn these skills? Again, if you'd like to get better at this stuff, you can talk to me after the webinar and I'll point you in the right direction. Also, if you're a geologist, you have to remember that you will be the point of contact for mining companies that are overseas that are coming into Egypt. And since you are the point of contact, you are in a place of responsibility because whatever you're doing should benefit the people of Egypt. And with these large mining companies, things can get pretty tricky. So you have to decide whether to go with a large mining company, go with a smaller mining consulting company versus going for individuals. So this is again something we will talk about later on. Now I'm talking and stalling because we still have people that are joining us. And as they're joining us, I have to not only admit them into the room, but I also have to make sure everyone is muted so there's no interference. If you were an engineer, I think the one thing you need to focus on is what kind of machinery will be needed, because the kind of machinery that we require for placer coal deposits is completely different than the sort of machinery needed for lode gold deposits. Then you have to figure out where would you be able to acquire that machinery and what are the costs of that machinery. If you are an investor, then of course that you should be thinking about the cost of land, because I'll be showing you places in Egypt that are more prone, or I should say they're more prospective for placer gold mining versus others. And then what your overall investment would be, because it's not just land, it's bringing in expertise to do a survey, it's bringing in machinery, and of course, what is the rate of return? So no matter what category you belong to, these are questions I want you to be thinking about. All right, hold on just a second. For some reason, it has drawn these lines on my screen. So let me go to annotate, clear all note drawings. There we go. Okay. So first of all, what is placer gold? Well, when you're mining for gold, there's two different categories. There is lode gold. Some people call it host rock gold. So lode gold is the gold that is still stuck in the rock. So we've got igneous rocks, which are volcanic rocks. So as magma is coming up, whether that magma comes out of the volcano or whether it stays inside, that is the igneous rock. Rocks that undergo heat and pressure and change their properties become metamorphic rocks. And these are the sorts of rocks that we usually find gold in. Okay, so these are your host rocks, or you can say that this is your lode gold. This is the gold that is still stuck inside these rocks. Now what happens is, over time, these rocks get broken down by the effects of weathering and erosion. So you can have rain falling on these rocks. And as that happens, those rocks are slowly broken down. And as those rocks are broken down, they are moved by initially by the influence of gravity, later on by rainfall, and eventually they end up by rivers, and then rivers start carrying them. So rocks that are broken off and carried away, that is placer gold. Okay, and that's the kind of rock mining that we will be focusing on in this particular talk. So let's start with what some of these rocks look like. So I've drawn the schematic for you. So here's some metamorphic rocks. I'm show you an example of those. There's a picture from the Baltoro Glacier up in Pakistan, where if you're hiking towards K2, this is what you get to see. And as you can see, there's a lot of veins in there, okay? These are essentially fractures that were filled by waters that were moving along them, and they filled those up with different minerals, okay? So hot waters going through, the technical term is hydrothermal fluids that are going through. And as those hydrothermal fluids are going through, they will precipitate minerals in there. So you can see here I've drawn one of these veins for you. So you've got quartz on the sides, and in the middle, you may deposit some gold. So these veins are super important. Here's a close-up of one of these. Of course, this is not the exact same vein. This is not from Pakistan. This vein is from Colorado, very close to where I live. And here you can see that the vein has been filled up with quartz. Now, quartz is just one type of fill. These veins could be filled up with feldspar. They could be filled up with a lot of different minerals. But for our sake, quartz veins are the ones that are most important. And the reason for that is that the majority of lode gold in the world has been found associated with these quartz veins. Now, one of the themes that I'll keep repeating throughout the webinar is when you are going after placer gold, what people tend to do is they tend to focus on the river itself or the rocks right next to the river. But instead of focusing on the river, what I would like for you to focus on are the source of rocks that the rivers have actually cut through. So let's assume, I'm going to show you examples of the Eastern Desert here, but let's assume we're not talking about the Eastern Desert. Let's talk about the Fayum Depression in Egypt, where you get all these fossil whales and fossil apes from. You could walk around for years in the Fayum Depression with a metal detector in your hand, looking for gold along these dry stream beds. And guess what? You're not going to find anything. Well, why would you not find anything in the Fayum? Well, you're not going to find anything down there associated with these rocks where, they're finding all the fossil whales and stuff, is because those are sedimentary rocks. Okay, so they're not the type of rocks that are associated with gold. So it's not about the river itself, it's about the sort of rocks that the river has actually cut through. So when you're going out there and you're looking at some of these metamorphic and igneous rocks, and then you start seeing these quartz veins, well, that's a good sign. So again, this was lode gold. This was gold that's still stuck in the rocks, in these veins. Now, as years go by and we start breaking the rock down, a lot of that rock pieces of that host rock start accumulating on the slopes. And those are known as residual placers. So I'm going to show you an example of those. Again, this is an example from Pakistan, from the Himalayas. You can see the mountain in the background. Here you can see some rock that is being exposed. And you can see parts of that rock that have been broken and they're scattered on the hill slope. Okay, that's the first thing you notice. The second thing I want you to notice is the color. I want you to note that the color is reddish brown. Well, why is it reddish brown? Well, imagine that you bought some tools. So you've got hammers and screwdrivers and nails. And what you do is you leave them outside for a few years. And then when you go back, you can notice that there's rust on your hammer, there's rust on your nails, rust on your screwdrivers. So what's going on? Where did all that rust come from? Well, what's happening is, in the presence of water, the metal inside your hammer and your nails and your screwdrivers, it's reacting with the oxygen in the air and it's oxidizing. And that's why you get rust. But you're getting the exact same thing happening here. Okay, as these hydrothermal or hot water fluids are coming up, they are bringing in what are called sulfide minerals. And a lot of them are rich in iron. So we're talking about pyrite, chalcopyrite, galena, these are coming up to the surface. And when they come up to the surface, years later, they react with the oxygen in the air and they oxidize. And that is why you're getting that red color. Well, that's a good sign. That's a beautiful sign that tells it's an indicator that, you know what, there has been hydrothermal activity in this area. And if you dug deeper, or even if you looked at some of these residual placers, there may be some potential in there. So how would you approach this? Let's assume you're in the eastern desert of Egypt. You see something like that. You see these broken rock fragments scattered on the slope. Well, you would collect them. And the next thing you need is a rock crusher. Now, rock crushers come in all sizes. You can get a small rock crusher, which is that big, but then you have to do all the hard work of actually putting the rocks in there and crushing them. Or you could get an automatic rock crusher, but the bottom line is this stuff has to be crushed. You cannot put pieces of rocks in a pan and start shaking it and then expect to get the gold on one side. That does not happen. So it has to be crushed first into a powdered form, and then you have to pan it, and then hopefully you can check for gold potential. So that's something said, that's something to keep in mind. Now, again, these are broken pieces that have just accumulated here by the effects of weathering and then gravity. Water has not acted on these yet. But what if water moves them along? Okay, water moves them along and then they accumulate further down from the mountain. In that case, we'll call them alluvial placers. Now, how do you know something has been moved around by water? So let me pop this up for you. So what happens is when water moves sediment, what it tends to do, it puts the largest particles at the bottom and the smaller ones on top, and even smaller ones on top. And we call this sorting, and this pattern we call normal grading. Now, gold has very, very high density. So even though the particles may be very small, when I say very small, we're talking about the size of a match head. Okay, it's not gonna hang out with the small particles on top because it has very, very high density. Those gold pieces are actually going to move all the way down towards the bottom. Okay, so water is fantastic because it does all the work for you. It puts all the gold at the very bottom in this one layer that you can start digging into. Okay, so that's what you're looking for. That's how you know that the sediment has been moved around by water. So those are alluvial placers. They have been moved around by water. So let's take a look at those. Here's a picture, again, this is from northern Pakistan. And what you're looking at here is here's the bedrock itself. And then right here are your residual placers, which are the ones that are just accumulating on the hillside just from the stuff breaking down. And when water moves these across, it's creating these terraces. Okay. And if you look at those, if you get close up to those terraces, you would find normal grading. And those are alluvial placers. So again, those are places that have potential for gold. And so if you saw this in Egypt, what would you do? You would just walk up and you would again go to the very bottom over here where you see this pattern occurring, and it can happen over and over again. And you would sample this stuff, pan it, and then you would know right away if there's any potential in there. Now, eventually, rainwater brings everything down to where the rivers are at. And now the rivers are going to start moving sediment, including gold. And those we call fluvial placers. So let's take a look at some fluvial placers. So again, there's a picture from northern Pakistan. And here you've got some gravel deposits moved around by this river when it was flowing higher. And you can see those gravels are sitting directly on top of this bedrock. What is bedrock? Bedrock is the rock that these mountains are made up of around the river that the river has actually cut into. Okay, and you can see this gravel is sitting right on top. So why is this important? Well, let me draw it out for you. Okay, let's make a new one. All right, so let's assume here's the mountain, here's the bedrock. In fact, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make this more Egypt-like, the terrain. So it's not those pointy mountains like in Pakistan. All right. And then here's our river that only runs when it rains. Otherwise, the rest of the year it's dried up. Now, if you look at this stuff real close, if I got super close to this part, what would it look like? What I would see is the bedrock. Okay, and right on top of the bedrock, we've got river sediments. Now, when we're looking for the gold, remember, gold always wants to sink to the very bottom because it's super dense. So the gold is right here, right at the contact between this gravel and the actual bedrock itself. So think about this. If you show up, you have to dig down all the way to the contact of the bedrock and the gravel sitting on top. Now let's assume this gravel is maybe half a meter thick. Well, if it's half a meter thick or 30 centimeters thick, no problem. You can dig yourself, you can get to the bedrock, you can collect all that sediment, and you start panning it. And when you start panning it, it's about maybe half an hour worth of work, and you can do it easily. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do work which is easy. Okay, so here you can see the gravels are sitting directly on top of the bedrock. So if I showed up here, this is the first place I would go, and I would collect sediment right here. I would put it in a pan, and then I would use the stream water to pan it and see if I've got any fragments, and we call those fragments colors, if you see any colors of gold in the pan. Okay, but what if this gravel is not just 2 feet thick? What if it's 100 feet thick? Well, guess what? You're not digging into it then, because you're not going to spend days and days digging through hundreds of feet of gravel just to get to the bottom. Okay, so we're looking for bedrock streams. So let me show you. I would usually, at this point, I would show examples of bedrock streams, but I'm not going to focus on them too much in this particular talk because we're talking about Egypt and we're talking about the Eastern Desert. So we're going to take a very different approach. But just to recap what we've done here, in this picture, you can see multiple placer types. Here's host rock right there. So any rock that's inside the host rock is Lode Gold. Pieces of that get broken down and accumulate on the hillside. Those are residual placers. When rain moves that material around, we get alluvial placers. And finally, when it's being carried by rivers, we get fluvial placers. Okay, so these are the three of the most common types. Now, because we're talking about Egypt, I threw this in, which are Eolian placers. Now, here's an example. This is again from northern Pakistan. Here we've got some crystalline rocks, so they're metamorphic or igneous. And right around them, you can see this desert. So you see these sand dunes. Now, if you went out there, and in this case, the best tool to use is a metal detector, and I am going to talk about metal detectors here in a little bit. Usually for mining, I don't recommend metal detectors, but this is an exception to the rule. And the exception to the rule is if you have a situation, all right, I got to mute someone, there we go. So the exception to the rule is when you're looking at Eolian placers. So when you've got deserts and all you have are dunes, wind is very good at sorting things out. So you go out there with a metal detector, and that's what you're using on the surface of these dunes to see if the clays and smaller particles have been moved along by the wind, and if gold colors are left behind. And I keep using this term. I hate this term. It's pretty lousy, but unfortunately, this is terminology that goes along with gold mining. So we're going to use this term. It's called colors. And this is, again, it's a horrible term. I don't like it, but unfortunately, we're stuck with it. Colors have absolutely nothing to do with the color of rock or gold. Colors are just small fragments, which are just pieces of gold that are size of a match head or smaller. Okay, so when you hear me say colors, again, it's stupid that it has absolutely nothing to do with the color itself of the gold or the rocks. We're just talking about small fragments or pieces of gold. And these are usually the size of a match head or smaller. Okay, so that's what we're talking about colors. Big pieces of gold, so we're talking about the size of a bean or the size of a pea or the size of a grain of rice. Those would be nuggets. So these are pea or bean size or larger. Okay, so these are when they're big, when they're larger, we call them nuggets. When they're small, we call them colors. So that's what you're looking for with a metal detector on these Eolian placers. So we've talked about 4 different kinds of placers now. We've talked about residual, alluvial, fluvial, and then Eolian. Now, let's move on and talk a little bit about the actual mining part. Now, again, what I want you to keep in mind is that the approach we take for exploration and for mining of lode gold, so the gold that is actually in the host rock, is completely different than the approach that we take for placer mining. So our exploration techniques are different. And once we have found the gold, our exploitation techniques are totally different. So the machinery needed to do this is completely different than the machinery required to mine placer gold deposits. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. So this again is a picture of Cripple Creek. It's about an hour and a half from where I live. And you can see here, you require explosives, you require machinery that's actually breaking stuff down, whereas this is very different. And of course, this is the stuff we are talking about. We are not talking about lode gold mining. Now, of course, Egypt has quite a bit of potential. It's been in the news lately. And these are some numbers that are coming out as to how much potential there is for gold in Egypt. But what I want you to remember is that these numbers are not all based on placers. They are actually based on gold that is essentially lode gold. Okay, but there are places where you can go to on dry stream beds close to these areas, and I'm going to show you some examples. Okay, so let's talk specifically about Egypt. Now, a lot of stuff has been published on lode gold deposits in Egypt, and that's a fantastic place to start. So you can see, here's a publication by Bakras, and what he's done is he's actually marked a lot of these gold deposits, and you can see that it's essentially a belt in the eastern desert of Egypt. So this is a location. I'm assuming you guys knew this already. Here's a geological map, and wherever you're seeing this belt right here of these colors, it's actually, there's a little bit on the Sinai Peninsula as well. That's not mentioned in the paper, but if all this stuff is productive, I would be very tempted to go out to the Sinai and test that part as well. Okay, so this is the belt where a lot of these gold deposits have been found historically. So this is where we start. You don't ever go out looking for gold without a geological map. Okay, even if you're just a prospector and you're not a geologist, this will really help you narrow things down. So the other thing you're doing when you're getting out there is you're looking at these publications that have already been made, and you're trying to figure out areas that have visible gold versus disseminated gold. Well, what's the difference? So here's an example of a vein. This is orogenic gold. This is from a mine in Australia. And of course, you can see the gold in there. Okay, so imagine this rock sitting in a stream bed, and eventually it gets broken down. And as it's broken down, all the gold that you're seeing in this rock is liberated, and then it's being moved around by the stream. And that is, of course, placer gold that you're looking for. But then let's look at the situation on the right. This is a Carlin type deposit. 65% of the gold that's produced in the US It's produced from rock, from deposits like this, from Carlin type gold deposits. Now, here's the deal. This is disseminated gold. What does that mean? What that means is it's microscopic, which means guys who have been working in these mines their entire lives, they have never actually seen the gold. Okay. Why have they not seen the gold? Well, they have not seen the gold because it's microscopic. So let's assume you have a deposit like this in Egypt. And then you see this, you read the paper, you're like, okay, at this particular location, I know there's big gold mines, and you go there, and now you're looking in the placers, and you're doing all kinds of stuff, but you're not finding any gold. Well, here's the deal. If you cannot see it in the host rock, guess what? You're not going to find it in the placers. Okay, it's there, but you're just not going to see it because it's microscopic. Well, why is this economic then? Well, it's economic because it's highly concentrated in this rock, even though it is microscopic. Okay, so why am I showing you this slide? I'm showing you this slide because when you're reading these papers that tell you that, hey, in this particular area, there's a gold deposit, well, then you have to read the paper and you have to figure out, are we talking about visible gold or are we talking about disseminated gold? Because if they're talking about disseminated gold, if it's a Carlin type deposit, it's a skarn, then most likely you're not going to find visible gold in that area, and you shouldn't be wasting time there. So how do you use the information that's been published? Well, again, this is from the Botros paper. And here he's given you a list. So he's given you a list of all the deposits in Egypt. He's given you a list of all the host rocks and the lode type. And what I've done is I have drawn arrows that have potential for placers. So as you can see, that's a pretty long list. But even though the list is long, not all of those would have visible gold associated with them. Okay? So I've drawn arrows for the locations that will have visible gold association and associated with them. So here's a famous mine. This is a Sakari mine. And you can see that right here. You can actually see the mine in these satellite images. And it looks like it's a surface mining operation. It's an open pit, very large open pit mine. Now, if this is where the mine is, then you can see all these dry stream beds around the mine. So depending on what the land rights are, if this is open access, if you're looking for placer gold, that's a fantastic place to go and start. So you would go and you would look in a place like this. You would show up with a pan. You would pan some of that sediment that's sitting right in those rivers, and then you would figure out whether there's gold potential in there or not. Now, I've talked about panning a lot. So those of you who are not familiar with panning, this is what I'm talking about. This is basically a plastic dish that you go out there with. These are very, very cheap. You can get Chinese made ones, for dirt cheap, for just a few dollars. And here's the challenge though. The challenge is traditionally panning is always done using water. Okay, that's how it is, because people, you assume that's a river, there's water that's going across it or flowing in it, and then you go sit by the river, you take the sediment, you pour it into your pan, and you use the water to pan. Well, if we go back to that previous slide and any other pictures that I'll show you of Egypt, there's really no running water. We're in the Eastern Desert. Okay, so what do? You can't use water to pan, and I don't recommend that you bring water just so you can pan. There is a technique called dry panning, okay, which is you're just panning without water. It takes a little bit more practice. It's a little bit trickier, but it can be done. So I've attached this link. It's a YouTube video. And all these talks that I give, they end up on our YouTube channel, and I'll put the link in the description as well. And if you want, if you email me, or if you send me a message on LinkedIn, again, I can send you this link so you can learn how to dry pan. I think for a place like Egypt, it's a very good technique to go out there and practice. So the whole purpose of panning is you want to test for gold, and it doesn't take long. It takes maybe a minute at best to do this test. And when you're testing, what I would recommend is, again, going back to the previous slide, if you're testing, let's assume this is the stream, and you're like, okay, Safari mine is close by, and this is an open area. It's not like the mine owns it. Well, in that particular case, you would go out there and you would pan here, pan here, pan here, pan here. You would pan in multiple spots, especially if you've got a geological map and it shows a fault cutting across the river. Those are excellent places for you to go pan. So you're dry panning. And when you're doing this, I mean, I would recommend if you're going to go all the way out there, because I'm assuming none of you are living out there. So if you're going to go out there and you're going to make a trip out of it, I would recommend doing at least 50 to 100 test pans. So if you're thinking that, oh, you know what, I went out there, I did 3 test pans and I didn't find anything. Well, you know what? You could show up to one of the best gold producing areas in the world, do 3 test pans, you're not going to find anything. Okay, that's just how it is. So you have to do multiple test pans. So when I go out to an area for a client or even on my own, and I'm trying to evaluate what the gold potential is, man, I'm doing at least if I'm going out on my own, I would do at least 10 to 20 test pans. If I'm going out there for a client, we're talking about hundreds of test pans, okay? The next thing I'm going to talk about is metal detectors. Usually, I never talk about metal detectors when it comes to gold mining. When it comes to prospecting, yeah, this is a fantastic tool. What's the difference? Prospecting is, let's assume one of you guys is a medical doctor. On the weekends, you're bored, and you've got a little chalet right on the beach on the Red Sea. So you go hang out at the chalet, you get bored in the winter, you go with your metal detector to some of these streams, and maybe you find a nugget or so, and that's your hobby. So prospecting is a hobby, and for that, metal detectors are fantastic. But for mining, usually they are not useful. But since we're talking about Egypt, and we're talking about Eolian Placers, I'll tell you this, metal detectors have been a game changer. People have gone to countries in West Africa and in Australia, and these metal detectors have literally proved to be a game changer because they pick up on gold that's laying around in these sand dunes, and then you can go ahead and do proper mining. But to initially find the gold, these metal detectors can be pretty darn amazing. Now, you have to remember that initially people invented metal detectors not for gold, okay? They were invented by the military for landmines and things like that. And then later on, old folks go ahead and they use metal detectors to look for rings and coins. So when you're going to buy a metal detector, please do not buy a cheap metal detector that was made for someone's hobby, okay? You're going to buy a metal detector that was specifically designed to find gold. And these are the top 3 metal detectors that are out there for finding gold. Of course, they're not cheap. These things they start at around $600, and then they can go to over $1,000, but most of them are around $800 or so. So they are very expensive. But again, if you're going to be mining, if you're a mining company or you're working for a mining company and you're focused on finding placer gold, Eolian placer gold, then these can be a game changer, as long as you're going for the right type. All right, so now let's assume one of you guys from your university, some of you guys that are listening to the talk, 3 or 4 of you decide to make a group, you go out there. So here you are, all right? So you're at this resort in Marsa Alam, right by the Red Sea. So you guys go stay there, and then you're like, all right, let's go. We know that there's Lode Gold potential in this area. So we're going to go out there with our metal detector and with our pans, and we're going to dry pan some of these stream beds. And you do that, and next thing you know, you see potential. Well, what's the next step? What do you do when you do find potential? Well, the next step is you have to secure the area. Who does that piece of land belong to? And this can be tricky because maybe you talk to someone at the resort. The guy was a chef at the resort, and he's like, yeah, not a problem. That land belongs to my nephew, and I'll introduce you to my nephew. The nephew's only 21 years old, and he's all excited to have you there. And he's like, you're my guest. Let me show you where where everything is at. And he treats you like a guest, and you're like, well, this is fantastic. So I'm going to come back here with equipment, and we're going to start doing, or we're going to contact someone who's a professional geologist specializing in gold, and he's going to come do a proper survey. So you contact me or my equivalent in some other company, and I come down there and I do a detailed survey and sampling the whole shebang. And when I'm done, I tell you that, hey, you know what? This area has a lot of placer gold potential. So then you're like, okay, now we want to bring in the mining equipment. And as soon as all the mining equipment arrives and you start doing, and they start processing the sediment, three guys show up and they're like, what are you guys doing here? And you're like, hey, well, we talked to Muhammad and he was, you know, this guy's nephew and Faris, and we talked to him and he said that we could come do that. And he's like, yeah, you can do it, but I want 20% of what you're doing out here. So again, these things are common sense, but you would be amazed at how many of these smaller gold operations go this route, okay? Because when people find out that you're digging for gold on their property, man, people get greedy. So all these things have to be sorted out before you even do a survey. So step number 2, the survey needs to be done by a competent person. Okay, what does that mean? Well, here's the deal. The deal is 90% of gold placer mining ventures fail. Now, if you're an investor listening to this, or if you're a business person listening to this, I mean, if I told you, if you were going to open up a restaurant in Cairo and I said, hey, you know what, if you open up a restaurant in Cairo at this particular location, there's a 90% chance that your business would fail. Would you still invest? No, you would not invest, okay? No business person wants to invest in a business where there's a 90% failure rate. Yet that is what the failure rate is when it comes to placer gold mining. Well, why is the rate of failure so high? I'll tell you why. Here's an example. This was a client that approached a partner company a few years ago, and they saw potential in northern Pakistan for gold. So this guy's email, and he's like, we would like to evaluate the deposit, yada yada yada. Assad, being geologist, can conduct sampling for assessment. However, he may need guideline from you to conduct sampling. Well, man, you know what? If someone could be taught how to sample and survey for gold over an email or with a webinar or over a phone call, well, man, you know what? Folks like us would not need to go get a master's or a PhD. Okay, we would email someone who could teach us over an email, and we'd be done with it. So this is why 90% of these ventures fail. This fail because of inadequate sampling. Okay, because this guy is not trained, and there's no way he can be trained over an email. Okay, so you need to find the right personnel. Now, the right personnel are not going to be cheap. The right personnel does not mean your local geology professor at the university. The right personnel does not mean the guy who's been working at the Geological Survey for the past 35 years, who's done a lot of different things in his life, but he's not familiar with the latest sampling and surveying techniques. Okay, so you have to bring in the right person, and when the right person comes in, they're not going to be cheap. Most consultants or even mining companies that are going to come in, they have a pretty expensive daily rate. So what people will do is they're like, oh, you know what? Let's not invest the money in doing that. Let's just, hey, you know what? What about this person? Let's bring in Ahmed. Ahmed knows about golf. Ahmed knows a lot about rocks, and he's been at the university for 30 years now. I'm sure he can do this for us. No, don't take shortcuts, because if you're going to take shortcuts, this is why these ventures fail. That's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is inadequate sampling. When I show up and I'm talking to a client and I'm like, all right, so I've looked at this area and I've collected 150 samples. It's going to be $50 per sample to do this, or $100 per sample, because all these samples have to be sent to a lab where they have to be assayed. Assayed meaning they're going to look at the rock, they're going to look at the chemical constituents, they're going to determine the fineness of the gold, which means if you're finding these colors, what percentage in that entire alloy is actually gold? What carat weight is it? Is it 22 carats? Is it 16? Whatever. That everything has to be done in a lab. It's not like I can look at it with a hand lens and determine that in the field. Okay. And when you send these to the labs are not cheap. Depending on where you send it, assaying could cost anywhere between $50 per sample to $200 per sample. So when I sit with people and I tell them, hey, you know what, I've collected 150 samples and this is what it's going to cost, then they're like, well, instead of sending in 150 samples, why don't you pick the top 50 and sand those instead. Well, yeah, I could do that. But every time you're taking these shortcuts, you are increasing the risk associated with this prospect. So again, keep this in mind. If you're going to do this, man, it has to be done the right way. It's a business. And if you're going to cut back on the investment in the beginning, there's a 90% chance that your business is going to fail later on. All right. Step number 3 is the economics. Oftentimes when I give this talk and there's experienced mining professionals in the audience, the first question they're going to ask me is like, hey, can you give us an economic cutoff? Grams per ton or milligrams per ton or grams per meter cube or cubic yard. Can you give us that number so we can use that? And I'll tell them that no, I cannot give you a number because it depends. Well, what does it depend on? Okay, so here's an example. All right, here's a road. Here's the Red Sea. Here's a road right there. Let's assume you guys went out there and this is where you found some potential. Well, if this is where you found the potential, man, this is easy logistics, because the biggest cost with mining placer gold is moving sediment with backhoes, moving sediment with bulldozers, bringing in machinery. So essentially the cost of placer gold mining is the cost of processing tons and tons, moving and processing tons of sediment. Okay. If this is right next to the road, well, this is a beautiful thing, man, because we can get mining equipment on this road, like trommels. We can get bulldozers. We can get backhoes. We can work this stuff real easy. And if we can work this really easily, then guess what? We actually don't need that many grams per ton or grams per meter cube. These are simple logistics, which means a lower economic grade can make this thing work. But take a look at this. Here's the road. Here's the border with Sudan. There's no roads out here. Let's assume this is where you found the stuff. Well, then you call me, or like I said, you call someone who's like me, who's a consultant or a mining company, and they're supposed to do a survey and sampling program for you. Well, how are we supposed to get out there? Okay, I mean, do I get on are you going to put me in a helicopter to put me out there? Are you expecting to put me on a camel, on a horse, or do you want me to hike the few days that it's going to take from this road to down here? Okay, how do you plan on doing that? So let's assume I get down there, because I like being outdoors, and I have no problems being on a camel or a horse, or a helicopter for that matter. So I get out there and I do the survey, and I'm like, okay, this place has a lot of gold potential. So what's the next step? Well, the next step is to bring in the machinery. Well, how are we supposed to bring that? The road is pretty darn far. So are you going to build a road? Or how on earth are you supposed to bring bulldozers and backhoes all the way back here? So again, these are things to be mindful of. So let's go to the next step. Now, if you were to sit down right now after this talk and you Googled placer gold, 90% of the pictures that you're going to get are going to be from either Canada, from British Columbia, from Alaska, or maybe a few from California, but most of them are going to be from, those places I just mentioned, and you're going to see tons of water. Okay, so here's a river. The Canadians will use dredging techniques, which means they've got a small boat that's moving on the river, and they're dredging sediment. So think about Egypt. Think about the Eastern Desert. Well, guess what's missing? The water's missing. Okay. 90% placer gold equipment is designed with water in mind, that you're going to have a limitless supply of water to do this. So let me go back to that last slide. Let's assume we're out here. How are you supposed to get the water out there? Okay, how much are you spending on water tanks coming in? Let's assume you somehow figure out a way to pump seawater from the Red Sea. You put it in these tankers. What is the cost? What is the cost of a pump going to cost? Then getting the water in those trucks, bringing those trucks full of water on the road that you built all the way out there. Can you see the economics? This thing just keeps multiplying. So again, the biggest challenge with placer mining, in my opinion, in a place like Egypt, especially, since most of these deposits are in the Eastern Desert, is the supply of water. So again, this is something you'd have to look into. Machinery specifically designed to go through sediments without water. Okay, and it's not like it's never been done before. There's places in Africa, in West Africa where it's done. There's places in Australia where it's being done. So it's not like it's impossible. But again, these are logistics that you have to keep in mind. All right, so whenever I end these webinars, I never have conclusions in there. I always have recommendations. So what are some of my recommendations for you? So my first recommendation is to do your homework, to look at geological maps and publications, because a lot of the, Egypt is not new to gold. The pharaohs used to exploit gold back in the day. So it's definitely not new to gold. There's a lot of work that's actually been done already for you. So don't start from scratch. Use the resources that you have to isolate areas where you have visible gold. So make sure you can differentiate between areas that are going to have disseminated versus visible gold. And then take the time to develop indigenous expertise. Involve the right foreign experts to help develop it. I cannot stress this enough. If you think about the world's largest deposits of copper, the world's largest deposits of minerals like cassiterite, they're not in the US, they're not in the UK, and they're certainly not in Europe. But where are they at? They are in some of the poorest countries in the world. So how does that make sense? How can a country have the largest copper deposits in the world and yet be one of the poorest countries in the world? Well, for two reasons. First of all, they leave everything to large mining companies. Large mining companies will show up, they will get whatever they can, and they'll leave. Some people get rich, some corrupt officials and the government get super rich, but it does not benefit the people of that country. And as a result, the company gets poor. Some people get rich, they'll most likely move out of the country, and then the mining companies make a lot of money off of this. So instead of using that approach, which you most definitely can, I would strongly urge, whenever I do these webinars, is you have to develop indigenous expertise, local expertise. Okay, so instead of having larger mining companies from overseas coming into Egypt and doing this, you should have your own expertise and do this yourself. Take the extra funds it takes to sample and exploit a resource effectively. If you're going to involve large mining companies, have a lawyer specializing in international contracts check it. This is it's a bigger deal than you can imagine. There's quite a few countries that I deal with where large mining companies come in, and when they come in and they're dealing with local officials, some of these mining contracts, they're 30 to 50 pages long. So, and they're filled with technical jargon. So if a government official is not qualified to read through those documents and be able to evaluate this, so you need a lawyer. And you don't need a lawyer that does marriage, divorce lawyers or lawyers who do, land rights. You need a lawyer who specializes in international contracts to be able to go through those, to make sure that the contract is set up in a way that it's not completely one-sided and it actually benefits the people of your country versus, the mining company only. So remember, deserts aren't usually the places where people go target placer gold. Water is a key limiting factor. So whenever you're going to do this, especially if you're a mining engineer, you need to think about how you are going to get past that challenge of doing placer mining when most large machinery is actually designed to run on water. Okay, so with that, I'll open up the floor to any questions